Good evening. It is wonderful to see everyone this evening. If you remember from last Sunday night, we are branching off in a way from what we've been talking about for the last few months. We've been talking about tactics, how to engage with people. We focused a lot on the Columbo technique that our book used to kind of give us questions and ways of approaching that kind of thing. And we're branching off now into a look at apologetics, which is fancy word, but we've probably heard it several times nonetheless, for a defense or an answer or something like that. We talked a little bit last time about what apologetics is and what it is not, and we also talked about the fact that as we're looking at this is not only meant to just give us information in general, it's meant to give us information that we can use when we're using our tactics, for example. So, if you are approached by someone who doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in the Bible, things like that, this is information you can use to help you craft some of those questions as you are trying to engage them, as we've been talking about in that series on tactics. So we talked some about what apologetics is and what it is not last time. So tonight we're going to look at the first of several different topics within this. Now, as we mentioned, any truth ultimately comes from God, which means a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, yes, is more focused on, I guess you could say, the natural world than specifically on Scripture, but that's because the natural world, as the psalmist tells us, points to God. And so some of the things we're going to be looking at, even though they are specific to the natural world, still reflect on spiritual truth. So tonight, we're going to look a little bit at DNA. DNA. Now, that stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, which you probably have never heard before and never need to think of again. But it's much shorter to say DNA, right? DNA is something that is just a fascinating thing. We're going to talk about it a little bit tonight because I would argue, just personally, it is one of the best evidences for the fact that we must have a creator. And we're going to look at some of the reasons for that tonight. But I chose to title this the data of life, or data of life, because DNA functions in a very specific way in our bodies. Essentially, as we think about our bodies, we're made up of cells. Now, if you put, part of a human body under a microscope, you can kind of make out some of those cells, depending on, just a minor microscope will still give you some of that. And if you get the really powerful ones, you can start to see inside of a cell. So, all these little cells, and there's billions of cells in every human body, all these cells have DNA. And what DNA does, essentially, is it is the information storage within that cell. Now, you might think, well, information storage, are there just, dudes inside your cells, like, reading books out of this information? Like, what are you talking about? Well, actually, what it does, essentially, just a very brief kind of summary of it, basically, you have a strand of DNA. This strand of DNA can unwind, connect to another strand called RNA. It's something different that'll come join with the DNA, and then that RNA will shape itself based on the DNA. The RNA will then go away, and it will pull different amino acids, different building blocks to create amino acids, which then can create proteins, which then ultimately are the building blocks of the cell. And as the cell is the building block of the body, ultimately, that means that the DNA houses within it all the information to build a body. That's how DNA works. That's the function that DNA serves within our bodies. Now, we said we can see cells with like a microscope, even sometimes, depending on which kind of cells we're talking about, we can see them with the naked eye, just barely. But DNA, I don't think, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, I know you know some science too, I don't think anyone's actually been able to unravel or to see with even a microscope the intricacies of DNA. It's that small. And yet, it carries all this information. I'm going to use a parallel to try and help us understand some of the concepts that we're going to talk about tonight, because it's a little bit confusing in some ways, and I think maybe this will help us out a little bit. Let's talk about computers. And you're like, this isn't going to help us at all. We don't understand computers either. I get it. Computers are confusing too. But let's follow me here for just a second. Let's talk about computers for just a second. A computer stores information too, right? If we got this laptop back here that I'm using for this PowerPoint, I can go on there and I can find information on that computer. There's already stuff on there. There's some other PowerPoints probably. There's documents. There might be music, like we do play it for the funerals and stuff like that. That's stored on there. It stores information. The way it does this is really interesting. Computers work in what's called binary code. That means that all this information ultimately is stored in ones and zeros. Basically what happens is if you have a sequence of ones and zeros, that unique sequence tells the computer what it needs to know to pull up a certain result based on the different switches and whatnot, stuff that I really don't understand at all. This is about as far as my computer knowledge goes in this front, okay? So it stores it in ones and zeros, just 2 digits, and it stores all the information. Now, just think for a moment, whether we're talking about a phone, a laptop, whatever, think about how much information you can store on a computer or a phone. I mean, you can basically store anything, right? And all that's done with just 2 digits, ones and zeros. That's incredible. DNA is actually very interesting. It also stores information, but it doesn't do it in 2 digits. It actually does it in 4. It has 4 instead of 2, 4 bases. They're called adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Again, names you never have to remember again, but we're just talking about for the sake of learning about this idea. It has these 4 bases. Now they pair, adenine pairs with thymine, cytosine pairs with guanine, but they pair together in such a way that as you're going down a DNA string or strand of DNA, you'll just have one of these 4 on each side, and when it splits, as we talked about, for a protein or a amino acid or things like that to form, what's on there is going to relate to what needs to go when you're actually building the thing. Again, try not to go too deep in the weeds here because I don't understand most of this. The bottom line is it can store, in some senses, scientists say, even more efficient information because it has 4 bases to work with instead of 2 like binary code has. Now, I don't know anyone in their right mind who would look at a computer and the way a computer stores information and say, oh, yeah, that just happened, right? Clearly there's intelligence at work. And that's just 2 digits being used to store information. Well, here's 4. But let's keep on going. Let's think about, going back to computers, how much storage a computer can hold. The largest hard drive on the market, as far as I can tell, that's available today, it can hold 100 terabytes of data. Now, that is a crazy lot of data. Used to, and I say back, 10 years ago, a terabyte was absolutely unheard of, like 1 terabyte, absolutely unheard of. You're talking maybe like, what would it be, 100 gigabytes? 100 gigabytes or something like that was like top end, whoa, this is huge. Well, today we can do 100 terabytes. That's pretty impressive. Costs $40,000 if you want to get something like that. That's how expensive the technology is to make something that can hold 100 terabytes of information, but that is available now if you have the money to pay for it. Most storages at this point are somewhere between 1 terabyte and 5 terabytes or 6 terabytes, 8 terabytes, something like that if you're talking about a computer, blah, 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 blah. We're really not interested in the computer side of things, right? We're just kind of giving a comparison. That's a lot of information. You can store a whole lot of music, a whole lot of video, a whole lot of whatever you want to store with 100 terabytes of storage. Well, let's think about DNA, because we can actually compare the two, since DNA also stores things similarly to the binary code type hard drives that we have. They store, or the hard drives store it with 2 digits, right, the ones and zeros. DNA stores with 4 digits, so we can compare. Guess how much 1 gram of DNA, how much do you think how much storage do you think that can hold? Any guesses? Danny's like, I know it's a lot. I know he's going to say a lot. Come on, give me some kind of number.
I can cheat.
Yeah, you hush up, Ray. You can cheat. Any guesses? How much do you think 1 single gram of DNA, how much information do you think it can store in terabytes? Do what? Not quite a billion, but you're getting there. What do you think? 100. No. 1 gram of DNA can hold 215,000 terabytes of data. And a single human body contains 50 grams of DNA. So multiply that by 50. Now we're getting closer to what Danny just said about 1 billion, right? Or at least over 1 million. I'm not going to do the math in my head right now, but we get the idea. We, with all our ridiculously advanced technology, we can make hard drives that can store 100 terabytes of data. Pretty impressive until you compare it to DNA. And then it looks kind of silly. Now imagine, again, as we're going through this, just imagine that you found a system, you found an entity that could store 215,000 times 50, whatever that is, terabytes of data. Number one, that's so far beyond what we're capable of doing right now, you might assume, like it dropped from, an alien from outer space or something like that, some kind of time traveling or advanced technology, right? Because that's so far beyond what we can do. But number two, you think there's any chance in the world that that just happened? Oh yeah, that 100 terabyte thing that's super impressive that took us forever to come up with, that definitely was created by a human being, but this, this probably just happened. Okay, let's keep on going. Oh, I did do the math. Silly me, I forgot I did the math. Human body can hold 10 million terabytes of information. I was thinking already on to the next slide. 10 million terabytes versus 100. Well, let's go on to this next one, because this is really interesting. If you count up all the information, all the data that exists in the entire world, like every bit of distinct information in books, in video, in every way that we store information as human beings, they've actually estimated this. They've actually kind of come up with a figure of how many terabytes are in the world of data. It would only take the population of Pampa, Texas, to store all of the information in the entire world in DNA form. That's how, not just how much DNA is in the human body, that's how efficient it is. We're talking, what's Pampa? I think I looked it up. It's right around 15,000, 16,000 population. That's all it takes. 15,000, 16,000 humans worth of DNA, and you can store all the information in the entire world. Now let's compare that to where we are in terms of our technology. You think it takes a little more than 15 or 16,000 people's worth of working on storage devices and inventions and coming up with all that to store all the world's data? I mean, by definition, where is the world's data? It's scattered all over the entire world, right? And yet, this natural information storage system could store all that information in one fairly small city in the panhandle of Texas. And we're supposed to believe that just happened. One person has, as we've said, billions if not trillions of cells in their bodies. Each cell has so much DNA in it because each cell has to be able to produce proteins, all these kind of things. If you were to take all the DNA in a single human body and stretch it out, remember it's super thin, we understand that, but if you were to stretch it out, because it's this kind of, you've seen the double helix structure, right? This kind of swirl, whatever you want to call it, twist kind of structure. It's like a strand, twisted strand. If you stretched it out, just a single strand, it would reach to the sun and back 300 times. Now, I want you to just think about how long it would take for something to go all the way around the earth. Have you ever gotten out and just walked and tried to keep walking as long as you could? Yeah, that's not even a drop in the bucket compared to walking all the way around the earth. Well, now try going all the way from the earth to the sun. Well, that's several thousand times going around the earth. Well, then you multiply that times 300. That's one human body. That's how much DNA is compacted in a single human body. Whenever you compare that to where our information technology is today, I am not exaggerating when I say it's like comparing a supercomputer to a stone tablet that somebody made at the very beginning of history. It looks just stupid by comparison. This information that is just there already when we're born, coded into our bodies, versus the best our technology can offer, it's just not even worth comparing. But let's consider a couple other things. No one in their right mind, I hope, would deny that this 100 terabyte hard drive that we've finally been able to come up with, no one would deny someone made it. If you see that anywhere, whether it's in a building, out in the middle of the woods, whatever, your first thought is not, oh, I wonder how the forces of nature over a long enough period of time managed to come up with this. That's dumb. I don't mean to insult anyone, but just on its face, that sounds so dumb. And that's if it was empty. Even if there wasn't actually any information on it, it just is capable of holding 100 terabytes of data. No one would deny this has been designed. Well, that 10,750,000 terabytes of data that each human body can store in DNA, none of it's actually empty. It's all holding information. Whether it's information of how to make the building blocks of the proteins to make our cells, which make our bodies, whether it is how to unravel that so where that process can go on, whatever we're talking about, it's not even empty. Scientists for a while, this is kind of a side note, scientists for a while, they argued, well, actually, only 2% of our DNA is used for anything. The other 98% is just kind of leftover. It doesn't really fulfill a function because only 2% of it is actually what's called coding DNA that's specifically used for those proteins. Well, yeah, that's completely out the window now. No one believes that because they've realized, well, yeah, 2% of it's coding, but all the rest of it has other functions. Kind of like if you ever heard the term vestigial organs, where they thought things like the appendix don't actually have any uses. They're left over from our evolution from something else, and they used to have a function, but they don't anymore. Yeah, no. Every single organ in our body has a function. Now, the appendix, for example, doesn't have as much of a function as we get older, but when you're young, it is crucial to your immune system. So there's all these kinds of things that just, there's no way that they could come up with, or that they could come about without someone guiding the process. But let's go a different direction. Let's talk about numbers. Different numbers than we've already talked about. Think about this sentence. The world we live in is an incredible place. It would take lifetimes to explore it all, and even then we would miss something. It took me a little while to come up with this sentence. The reason, this sentence has exactly 100 letters. We're not counting spaces, we're not counting punctuation. This sentence has exactly 100 letters. Now, I want you to imagine, we take probably multiple Scrabble games, okay, because it would take multiple ones to have enough letters to do this. We take multiple Scrabble games, and we spell this sentence out with the tiles from Scrabble. Then we take all those letters, we put them in a box, or bag, or whatever. We shake it up, or all the letters are scrambled up. What do you think the odds are that we pull out the letters in the perfect sequence to spell out this whole sentence? Just this one little 100-letter sentence. What do you think the odds are that we pull out this sentence? All the letters are there. It's all the right letters. It's not like we're missing letters or anything. It's not like we have the wrong letters. What do you think the odds are? Let me ask this. 1 in 1 followed by how many zeros? Someone said 1 in a million. Oh, you need to dream much bigger. 1 in a million is nothing in the realm of possibilities. It's a lot, don't get me wrong, but the kind of numbers we're talking about, that's nothing. A million has 6 zeros. Billion has 9 zeros. Trillion has, 12 zeros. Let's see, what is the next one? Quintillion has like 15 zeros. The odds, yeah. the odds that you put all these letters in a bag and shake it, it's 1 in 1 followed by 158 zeros. Now, that's ridiculous. I have no idea what that number is, right? I get lost, right, at quintillion or quadrillion or whatever is the next one after that, okay? 1 followed by 150 zeros. That's only for 100 letters. We already mentioned all your DNA just in one human body. You stretch it out to the sun and back 300 times. Think about how many sequences are contained in DNA that stretches to the sun and back 300 times. I think it's a little more than 100 sequences. But here's the other thing that we have to remember. And as much as you have scientists, mathematicians, all these people that do not believe in God, when it comes to just probabilities, I don't think there's anyone who disagrees with this statement. Anything higher than 10 to the 150th power, that's 1 followed by 150 zeros, is considered impossible. Doesn't matter how much time is involved. Doesn't matter how long you wait. Doesn't matter any variable that you put on there. If it's 1 in 150, 1 to 10 in 150 or more, it can't happen. Not it's unlikely to happen. Not it's, going to take millions and millions or billions and billions of years for it to happen. It can't happen. And we just showed just 100 pieces in the exact right sequence at random is already impossible. Now, you might say, well, but let's say that, we don't spell that exact sentence, but we spell a different sentence that still has some words that are actual words, not just gibberish. Okay. But then we still have a problem, right? Because even if they spell some words, do you think it's going to be a sentence that makes sense in any kind of way? And again, we're only talking about 100 pieces. This is not possible. Unless there is some thing, whether we're talking about some kind of intelligence, something, some force, some entity, if there's nothing guiding this process, it can't happen. The only way this happens is if there's another factor in here that takes it from completely impossible to, oh, now this is possible. And of course, I think we're all aware exactly what or who that entity is. 1 cell's worth of coding DNA. Remember, this is coding DNA. Remember we mentioned the 2%? This is just the 2%. 1 cell that has its coding DNA, it contains 30 million base pairs. If things get out of order, you don't have life. Just 100 letters, it's impossible if it's just left a chance. We're talking about 30 million in 1 cell. By the way, how is it that evolutionists say life began? A single cell forming in some kind of soup or something? Yeah, exactly. 1 cell. I don't think this happens. Not just it probably didn't happen. It's not possible. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I am absolutely convinced that if Charles Darwin knew anything about DNA, remember, DNA had not been discovered. It wasn't even on the radar when Charles Darwin proposed his original theory of evolution. If Charles Darwin had known about DNA, or really if anyone at the time had known about DNA, number one, I don't believe he ever would have proposed his theory in the first place. I mean, he himself says in Origin of the Species, that's his book where he proposes evolution, he himself says something as simple as bees building a beehive could dismantle his entire theory. If he had known about DNA, he would have laughed himself out of even writing the book. If his colleagues had known about DNA, no one would have ever listened to him. As it was, there were a lot of things that hadn't yet been discovered, and by the way, we might talk about this in another lesson, his initial ideas are talking about change within small parameters. For example, we have 3 dogs at our house, right? Well, they're all dogs, but one of them is a Poodle and Yorkie mix, one of them is a Poodle and Maltese mix, and one of them is a Schnauzer. They're all dogs, but there is that slight change between different breeds and stuff like that that can happen. That works with DNA. There are changes within a limited system, within species and stuff like that, but you never have species crossing over another species. When you actually just boil it down to the facts, there's all sorts of intricate, elaborate explanations people try and give to explain this stuff away. When you just boil it down to the numbers, this doesn't work. It's so far beyond not just the realm of probability, but the realm of possibility. It's so far beyond anything that could happen. Now, as we begin to conclude, I want us to think about some of the things we've been looking at over the last few months. If someone, for example, were to suggest that in a conversation, you're having a conversation with someone, they suggest it's like, listen, I appreciate that y'all try to be moral people and all these kind of things, but believing in God just isn't rational. It just doesn't make sense. There's so many scientific facts that disprove evolution. Disprove God and creation. This is why we're studying these kind of things. To give us information, to give us tools. If someone asks that, ask them questions about something like DNA. Probably things they've never considered before. But ask them some questions about something like this in the ways that we've been studying. You're asking them about science, which they say is, the basis for why they don't believe in God. Ask them. Just see. Just see how they respond. Because when you just give the evidence, I'm not interested, okay? And this is something that we need to make sure that we're on the same page about when we're talking about these things. We don't need to be interested in what we've always believed, what we've always thought, all those kind of things. That's not why I defend things like God creating the universe. I don't create it just because that's what I've always heard. I create it because the evidence. It's overwhelming. I believe that Christ rose from the grave because the evidence, it's overwhelming. Anything we believe, ultimately, it should come back. Not only the fact that I've chosen to believe it, but I've chosen to believe it because it's the only thing that makes sense. With all of those numbers, with all of the ways we can think about this, how could we possibly believe that DNA simply happened? Without any design, without any input from any intelligent entity, it just happened. Essentially, as you read some of the evolutionary type explanations for things like this, they essentially have to create this kind of mystical force, whether they call it natural selection or natural law or whatever the case might be, that essentially they just kind of vaguely allude to, but they basically have to give it the quality of an intelligent being almost. Although they would never say it like that, they would never admit it. Because that's the only way this works. They have to have something, some kind of mechanic, something that allows for this kind of thing to happen. Because if you're just leaving it a chance, it can't. I mean, that's all there is to it. The mind-blowing scale of information storage in our DNA demands an intelligent designer. Again, just throw out some of those numbers. Someone's like, it doesn't make sense to believe in God. I'm like, okay, so it makes sense that mankind can only do as good as creating 100 terabyte storage, and a human body has 10 million terabyte storage. But that just happened, whereas, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. There has to be an intelligence. And of course, he has revealed himself, exactly who he is and how he did it. He spoke it, because that's how powerful he is. We're going to continue on looking at different aspects of the natural world and probably going on to some other things as well. But I hope this is helpful for us, both just strengthening our own faith, but also giving us ways that we can see, if I get into a conversation like this, with this friend, with this whoever, if I get into a conversation like this, I have directions I can go with my questions. Because as we're asking those questions, as we've learned how to do, there comes a point a lot of times where we have to learn how to kind of take it in a specific direction. So I hope this is giving us some help in that regard. As we close, as always, we want to remember that the Lord's invitation is open. Just as he took such great care in designing the world, he has taken such great care in designing the church as a place that we can encourage one another and strengthen one another. We're going to look at, I can't remember if it's next Wednesday or the Wednesday after, I think it's next Wednesday. We're going to look at this idea of stirring one another up to love and good works. That's what God designed the church to do. And that's what we always want to provide the opportunity to do for one another. So if there is something we can do to encourage you tonight, please let us know as we stand and sing.
Would you be free from your burden of sin?
There's power in the blood, power in the blood.